Whether it was a blessing or a curse, Cassie wore the benevolent version, which meant she gave everyone more credit than they deserved. So when Rich told her he loved her craziness and didn't want her to change, she'd laugh and think it was a compliment, when in reality, it was one of the control tactics he used to keep her small and compliant. Now it's time for Puppets, Pupils, and Producers, a story of mind over matter. Since he said he was going to read it, Cassie set the book about children of alcoholics on Rich's bedside table and purposely did not move it or dust the cover, because unbeknownst to him, the continuation or conclusion of their marriage depended on whether he read the 240 pages or not. Secretly deciding she'd give him 6 months to do so, she circled the date on the calendar and kept reading more self-help books, which Rich did not like her doing at all. At first she told herself he opposed her personal development work because he feared she'd outgrow him. The truth, however, was much darker, but she couldn't see it because, unlike rose-colored glasses, her glasses were tinted by trauma, which made it hard for her to see Rich's true intentions. Like some of the folks who wore trauma-tinted glasses, Cassie wasn't even aware she was wearing them. Since she wasn't aware of their existence, she also didn't know there were 2 types. The malevolent version made everything appear darker than it actually was. Good intentions were suspect, and the world was a corrupt, dog-eat-dog kind of place. The benevolent version made everything appear lighter than it actually was. Bad intentions were not suspect, and the world was a moral and supportive kind of place. Whether it was a blessing or a curse, Cassie wore the benevolent version, which meant she gave everyone more credit than they deserved. So when Rich told her he loved her craziness and didn't want her to change, she'd laugh and think it was a compliment, when in reality, it was one of the control tactics he used to keep her small and compliant. As difficult as it was for her to see his true intentions, she did catch a glimpse now and then, but every time she shared her observations with Rich, he'd remind her he wasn't one of her patients and she should stop analyzing him. And since his calculated mistreatment was done in private, every time she'd share her observations with her friends, they'd gently suggest she was oversensitive and too critical. Then she read the recently released book called The 5 Love Languages and realized she wasn't hard to please or needy, but depraved. To prove his cold-heartedness to herself, she made a graph of the 5 languages, and without Rich knowing, she tracked how many times he said or did something loving for 1 week. Except for complimenting the special dinner and cake she made for his father's birthday, the only check marks were in the category of physical touch, which in her mind didn't really count, because on both occasions his touch preceded the obligatory sex she dutifully attended to. The second week she had her period, and the last 2 teams were competing for the Stanley Cup, so she was essentially ignored, and the page remained blank. During the 3rd week of her clandestine study, she tracked the unloving things he said and did, and by Wednesday, she needed a 2nd page. Like the book he promised he'd read, he promised he'd go to marital counseling with her, but her glasses prevented her from being able to see he'd never go. So she kept on pressing him for a date that worked and finally made the appointment, which she showed up for, but he didn't. Using the excuse of car trouble, he thought he'd outsmarted her, but his plan backfired because the sessions went on without him, and the little bit of clarity each one brought changed her perspective. When the therapist asked what brought her to counseling, she started by sharing that she couldn't prove it, but she suspected Rich had cheated on her several times. Then she confirmed if she could prove it, their marriage would be over. She also confessed she'd cheated several times too. The only difference was that he was motivated by his pleasure, whereas she was motivated by his pain, which was the reason why he was discreet and she did it openly. She said she knew her vindictiveness was sick and twisted, and she didn't enjoy it because there was no connection. But her ego was starving, and having a man tell her she was beautiful and sexy fed it temporarily. Trouble was, it also induced a form of bulimia, because after she binged on a man's attention, the purging of her self-respect would follow. Similar to trying to kill him by drinking the poison herself, she recognized her behavior was harming her more, but not because she felt guilty, but because despite his knowing about most of her indiscretions, he protested very little. She couldn't wrap her head around why he'd forgive her for cheating relatively quickly, yet he'd threatened to leave her if she dared to question his. None of it made any sense to her, because once again, she couldn't see the disturbing truth, which was that he needed her to hate herself and didn't care how she went about it. Her trauma-tinted glasses also prevented her from seeing his treatment of her as abusive. Instead, she dismissed his teasing and insults as his way of expressing himself. She accepted the apology flowers and tacky lingerie as gifts when they were anything but, and she believed his lies and excuses and blamed herself for how badly he treated her. Otherwise, she'd have to admit she'd married a man who hated her more than she hated herself. As a result, the most troubling revelation she shared with the therapist had nothing to do with how her husband treated her, but rather they were based on how he treated others. So despite his infidelity and abuse, it was his cheating at every card game, board game, or sport that bothered her the most. Even when money wasn't involved, he had to win at all costs. If he didn't, he'd pout, he'd insult his opponent, or he'd lose his temper and may even attack them. Along with being the ultimate sore loser, he talked down to those he thought were below him and envied the select few he thought were above him. Instead of earning respect and recognition for his own merits, he bragged about knowing influential members at the country club, who he thought made him important by association. Even worse, he was an entitled thief who exploited people's trusting nature. Taking what wasn't his didn't bother him at all. It was his victims' fault because they were careless and deserved to lose their money or valuables. What was even more backwards was that in his mind, he was doing something good because he was teaching them a lesson. His lack of empathy met the last of the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, but the therapist wasn't about to diagnose Rich until he assessed him himself, so a second appointment was made, which Rich also did not attend because he said they'd had a kitchen fire at the country club. They went ahead with the session again, and this time Cassie talked about her parents and the domestic abuse she grew up watching. When the therapist asked if she'd ever thought about how different her childhood would have been had they divorced, Cassie responded that she would have grown up without a mother because her father would have killed her if she tried to leave. Then the doctor explained how on average a woman tries to leave an abusive relationship 7 times before she's successful. and shocked Cassie by asking how many times she'd tried to leave Rich. When she replied she'd tried 4 times before they got married, the therapist asked if she stopped trying because she was convinced her husband would kill her too, to which Cassie replied yes. When Rich realized she was going to marital counseling without him, he decided to show for the 3rd appointment, but he only lasted for half of it because he thought the therapist was condescending and left the session saying he had better things to spend his money on. Cassie, on the other hand, wanted to change for her children's sake, so she stayed. After making an excuse for Rich's outburst, the doctor asked if she'd ever read the myth involving Narcissus. Admitting she'd heard parts of the story in college, but never read it herself, Cassie shared her understanding, which was that the story warned against grandiosity, excessive pride, and vanity. While the doctor agreed that her understanding was partially true, he went on to explain how the story also spoke to his lack of empathy, especially for those who loved him, which led him to being cursed after a rejected admirer wishes he'd suffered the same fate of desiring someone who didn't desire him in return. The other important piece of the story, he said, was a seer's response to his mother's question regarding his longevity, which was that he would live a long life as long as he never came to know himself. This is why those with the namesake disorder are incapable of anything but superficial love, and because insight would be the end of them, they don't seek therapy or read self-help books. This is also why they resent anyone who possesses healthy self-love. They sat in silence for a moment. Then the doctor asked if she'd seen those traits in her patients or anyone else, and Cassie began to cry.